Namaskar. Welcome to yet another journey in a fascinating experience called India. And in the way in the pandemic we are going to access India through this virtual tour is the lens of the ecotourism. Today we are talking about pollution, climate change. We're locked into our houses, yet how do we get into the world of nature and replenishing our energy? So let's go on. Today, we enter the western world of India in a small union territory now merged with Daman and Diu called Dadra Nagar Haveli. Situated as a landlocked union territory between Gujarat and Maharashtra, made of two districts, Dadra on one side of Daman-Ganga and Nagar Haveli on the other side of river Daman-Ganga. This landlocked territory has fascinating historical parts, but more so the intermix of the old and new coexisting like everything in India where centuries do not die. How do we reach there? Silvassa is the major city in this union territory. Vapi, a very important train station. Navi Daman, the airport. You can drive from Mumbai 180 kilometers. And let's go into this world of the main idea of where we are going to come with lakes and forests and inspired by the idea of ecotourism. We are reminded of Robert Frost's famous line, woods are lovely, dark and deep, and we have promises to keep. So the journey is on. The history of Dadra Nagar Haveli has, of course, like everything else in India, the past and the present, and many, many layers of people coming in, fighting with each other, cultural responses to geographical context, and here, of course, the forest. This particular region, which is on the foothills of the Sahyadri Hills of the Western Ghats, has an interesting anecdote that the Marathas who gave Dadra Nagar Haveli as an idea of collecting revenues because they had by mistake drowned a ship, and they asked the Portuguese to collect the revenues in return for a compensation. When the Maratha Empire fragmented, then you know what happened? They actually quite forgot about Dadra Nagar Haveli, and the Portuguese very calmly, even while the rest of the India was contesting with the British powers, Nagar Haveli, Dadra Nagar Haveli became a part of the Portuguese little empire in India. The main city, we need to understand that this particular areas of coming together of what we call parampara. In the Indian idea, we do not have a clash between tradition and modernity. We always have a flowing tradition. The old becomes a part of our present. And nothing better than this area of Dadra Nagar Haveli, where you have industrial towns existing with traditional ways of doing business, with man-made lakes in tandem with the waterfalls and rivers. So the coexistence, and let us go ahead. We have industries and then the indigenous community systems. Yes, in the next slide of 7, we have tribal cultures. We have old buildings like the Portuguese churches and fascinating ways of looking at Portuguese architecture. But we also have the old remodeled as new in this very elaborate, beautiful Swaminarayan temple architecture, where we have the old idioms of Vastu Shastra or architectural aesthetics imprinted on this very magnificent modern temple with old imagination. We also have designed heritage gardens. For instance, the nature garden with all kinds of biodiversity called the Paryavaran, Prakriti Kendra, but we also have the natural forests. We have man-made lakes and we have natural waterfalls. As part of nature, when we get tired and we want to run away, as we are just now, or very, very caught up in our everyday life, what do we want to do? Get that reflection, that balm on our senses through nature walks. Yes, in Dadra and Nagar Haveli, for instance, in the Khedka village, we go into the forest and recollect ourselves, reimagine a sense of freedom. The indigenous communities, while many of them have come into towns and created a modern livelihood for themselves, many of the indigenous communities continue harnessing the forest produce like that of honey. You know, when we're talking about overuse of an arrogant use of nature and forest resources and natural resources, these traditional communities continue to create a kind of a collective memory of how beautifully human beings could be balanced with nature. These indigenous communities, a number of tribes like Warli, Kokan, Dubra, and many others, they have statements of respect for nature. In this slide of 13, for instance, they are scared of the wrath of nature and they have a medicine man who's also an occult practitioner called Bhagat, who is constantly reminding that nature can actually subdue human arrogance of controlling the cosmic forces, reminding that India, as a very ancient and continuous kind of a continuous civilization, the entire South Asian context, you have the famous idea of nakshatra astrology, astronomy that go hand in hand in understanding biodiversity and the way it impacts our yantra, our body systems. And so inside the Dadra Nagar Haveli, we have the nakshatra garden, the cosmic forces coming together. In the man-made lake, in this slide of 15, we have Dudani Lake, which is, and the river of waterfalls that appear. So in Dadra Nagar Haveli, a very important context is the monsoon, when rivers and forests revive themselves, and there's a lot of insect activity and bird activity and butterfly activity and animal activity. So it becomes a station for monsoon retreat, finding ourselves as well. Finding yourself in nature. Are we going to hear the whispers of our own consciousness in terms of our waterfalls and birds chirping? Yes, we can. In slide number 18, we have this whole interest of how the oldest human species represented by the tribal communities were very conscious that cultural heritage means responses to the nature. And one of these is that to do with intoxication of toddy. Yes, toddy is very important and a natural heritage of breweries. So while the world is talking about whiskies and rums and wines, in India, we have a continuous idea of intoxicants and toddy. There are two kinds of plants where communities actually perform rituals. So, for instance, one of my resource persons, he told me a toddy seller and a picker of the beautiful juices of the toddy fruit. He told me how elaborately they create this as a creative heritage knowledge. So, in the time of October to November, they harvest these berries of two main plants, the date palm and what is locally called the tar palm. Before climbing this very precarious tall palm trees, they perform a ritual. And in this ritual, they have a, a poultry animal like a cock, which they tie, and they make their wishes that may not they be attacked by bees, because the bees are their competitor to gather that honey. So they should not be attacked by bees, and they should not be attacked. Their journey on that thin plant should be smooth. They should get a good harvest of that juice, and when they come back, then when the season is over, then they sacrifice that particular poultry chicken. Now, when they climb up, then when they come down with their pot of juices, the first little drops they sprinkle on the earth, because the earth is everything to them. The earth is mother, protector, and so on. When we come to the next slide, then we have a whole history, a whole heritage of how the local intoxicant is going to be prepared. They filter it, they clean it, they dry it, they boil it, they distill it. Yes, we have a whole history right from the Rig Veda to now, a continuity of liquor. Nature is so overwhelming to these indigenous communities that everywhere in India you go, you have nature imprinted as cosmic forces from within in the art of tattooing. But let us look at something else, the symbol of a very important animal, the king of the jungle, the tiger and the lion. The tiger and the lion is represented in the worldly painting, and it is believed that every time a tiger comes into the farm by the worldly indigenous community, they clap their hands, they welcome him, because he's a symbol of rejuvenation and beckoning a good harvest. So in slide number 24, we also have something which is a conservation program. Nearby, you have the Gir forest, where you have the program of the Asiatic, the majestic Asiatic lions. And that program has overflowed into the lion safari of the Vasuna Project Park in Dadra and Nagar Haveli. The Khetka village and the world is very important, that where you have again and again, you keep going into the forest, you do agriculture, but then you are really reminded that Mother Earth is the most supreme of all. And in this particular idea that Mother Earth is supreme for all, we come to the next slide, which is 26. The Mother Earth has three connotations: Anna, Arogya, and Asara: food, well-being, and protection. And that Mother Earth, as a geometrical figure, is enclosed in a square from the imagination of the Wali tribe, overviewed by the forces of nature like the sun and the moon. And that Mother Earth comes alive on paintings of walls and the imagination, how you access nature in your daily lifestyle. These indigenous communities, by the way, have the government support in terms of a tribal museum in Dadra and Nagar Haveli. So while you can do tribal ecotourism connected with nature, going into different villages, you can also create a holistic understanding through the tribal museum. And within this context, in this slide of 27, I bring to you a whisper of a ritual called a performing art called Bhavada, which is linked with the mother goddess, which is linked and come very closely to the higher Brahminical thought of goddess Bhavani. And for 3 days, people ask their wishes, they go to the foothills, create the Bhavani altar, and for 3 nights they offer her food, beckoning good harvest to prosper. And in this ritual, when we come to slide number 28, the Bhavada ritual employs wooden masks of different spirits and natural forces, and now mythological characters from the Mahabharata and Ramayana. And all the farmers and these communities, they actually commission these Bhavada performers to come into their homes, and they perform song, dance with a lot of fanfare. And the Bhavada continues through the time, beckoning good forests, good crops, and good rainfall, and a good harvest. We come to slide number 29. When we look at the Valli paintings, which have become very popular in textiles and craft objects all over India, we see some similarity. It belongs to the prehistoric tradition that we find in the Bhimbetka caves in Madhya Pradesh, the rock shelters. You have the same kind of imagination. So here we see the representation of a very similar tradition that we see in Valli in the Bhimbetka caves, not here, but in Madhya Pradesh. The Valli painting on slide 30 actually brings in the idea of geometry and circles and triangles and squares made with rice powder on the houses, and now, of course, commercialized and brought into workshops with schools and children and other artists doing word painting, and of course, as block printing idioms, etc. But one of the most beautiful things which they represent is not only their lifestyle, everyday lifestyle, but they represent the circle as an endless idea of births, constantly. So they have so much hope of human species despite climate change continuing, the endless cycle of birth. So as we are coming closer and closer to our journey in Dadra and Nagar Haveli, and we see this beautiful bridge in slide number 31, something which is talking as a metaphor to us, the old and the new, the inside and the outside. The Daman Ganga bridge and the riverfront of Dadra and Nagar Haveli is a call to connect the outside with the inside. This particular lake is so beautiful because it comes out from the dam and you have water sports. So when you go to Dadra and Nagar Haveli, you have several kinds of activities: nature walks, heritage walks, new monuments, linking up with nature, and water sports, and just relaxation and enjoying with your family. The things to do also is, how can we live without food? So the new and the old, the indigenous communities, where the food is very simple, and something which is so peppy and happening with modern cuisine, Gujarat, Maharashtra, all coming in one. Everything that is all about India, spices and rainbow country experiences also available in Dadra, Nagar Haveli. Next how can we are in a forested area, so wildlife tourism, in terms of the safari, as we mentioned before, the national bird happens to be a flameback woodpecker of this region. So beautiful, the woodpecker as industrious, so important to understand the character of the original citizens of this area. And of course, you have the deer park and you have the butterfly park. Can you imagine watching the lovely butterflies, the silent way they are moving from being a caterpillar to a cocoon to this wonderful flavor of what we call the colors of India? We come to crafts and see this beautiful lantern. It's symbolic. I could have brought in many other things, but I brought in this from the huge index of the crafts that you get in this area. The lantern, which is a light that nature will give you the light forward as you come into the experience of ecotourism. And finally, as we are discovering ourselves, we look at this area where the basketry is very important. These are carriers of culture. And inspired by looking at these baskets, may I share with you a few lines that I have written as poem in honor of this beautiful story of India, Dadra Nagar Haveli. Lost in the forests of modern wasteland leads to the path of forested hopes. We walk to reclaim what we might have lost and what might be left in us, rediscovering the potent seeds in the baskets of culture. Thank you. We'll meet you again with yet another story of India. With me, Navina Jafa.